Good afternoon and welcome to the first event in EOA's webinar series on greening in European higher education institutions, which runs in parallel to the EU's own Green Week. My name is Henriette Stöber and I'm a policy analyst at EOA's Higher Education Policy Unit. Today, together with the speakers, we will discuss on how institutions' environmental sustainability and greening activities are impacting their mobility and internationalization. Before handing over to our speakers, I would just like to share with you a couple of technical updates and information. You can see here on the slide a couple of ways to join the discussion in this webinar. But actually, first of all, I should point out to you that the webinar is being recorded and that the recording is going to be made available on EOA's YouTube channel in a day's time. All registered participants will also receive the direct link and the PowerPoint presentations of our speakers today. Now, in terms of contributing to the discussion, there are two ways how you can interact with us. First of all, on the right-hand side of your screen, you can see the general chat. In the chat, you can say hello to us, tell us where you're from, ask us some technical issues or questions. In addition, then, we have a dedicated Q&A section. And in this section, we would like to very much encourage you to ask questions to the speakers, to reflect on what has been said based on the viewpoints of your institution, and to comment along the way. Also, we have a dedicated handout section. Here you can already find the PowerPoint presentations of our speakers, and in addition, a couple of other links and information, such as the links to a series of expert voices that EOA has recently published, also on the topic of greening in higher education. Now, about today's webinar, the webinar will be framed by the findings of a study that EOA has recently conducted, a survey of higher education institutions on their activities in the field of greening and environmental sustainability. These are somewhat preliminary findings. We will publish the full set of findings towards the end of summer or maybe in autumn, but we wanted to use the time frame of the EU's Green Week to already showcase some of our initial findings and also some of the examples that we have gathered through this survey. So the discussion will be framed by some of the findings, and these will be presented by our very own Michael Gebel. He is the director of the Higher Education Policy Unit at EOA. And then we will move on to two speakers from higher education institutions who we have asked to reflect a little bit on the findings of EOA's European sample, so to say, from the survey data that Michael presents. And they will also, of course, share with us the experience from their university. In addition, both of these speakers have kind of a double hat today. We also will ask them to tell us a bit more of activities of other stakeholder organizations in the field. So we will have with us today Chris Litvinuk, who is from the University of Edinburgh. Chris is a Sustainability, Innovation and Engagement Manager at the Department of Social Responsibility and Sustainability. And he will also say a couple of words on the work of the UNICA network, who has been very active in this field through UNICA Green. We also have with us today Arnim Heinemann from the University of Bayreuth. Arnim is the Senior Executive Director at the International Office of the University of Bayreuth, and he is also the President of the S Group Universities in Europe. In addition, we are very pleased to also share with you today the viewpoints of the European Commission, who will be represented by Marlene Barthes. Marlene is a policy officer at DG EHEA, DG Education and Culture, in the Msca unit. So without further ado, I would then like to hand over to Michael to give us a bit of information about EOA's survey and share with us some of the key findings we will discuss with the speakers today. And I would like to ask all the other speakers to switch off their cameras. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Henriette, and good afternoon, everybody. For those of you who do not know us, we are the umbrella organization of more than 800 universities and university associations across 48 countries in Europe, so much wider as the European Union, as you can see here on the map. And we engage basically in all areas of university activity where we can make an added value at European level. And more recently, we actually started to approach this topic of environmental sustainability. And before I tell you a bit more about or show you some of the data of the survey, probably a few points of why we actually conducted the survey. I mean, obviously the topic is of key importance, and I don't have to tell you about the Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda 2030 and the Green Deal. And obviously higher education institutions can play an important role, or I should better say play already an important role in this area due to the research they carry out, and also through education provision, and generally through their engagement with many different actors in society, including governments, NGOs, and businesses. And we also can observe that environmental sustainability also becomes increasingly a topic for more interinstitutional collaboration and engagement, and is the purpose of dedicated university networks. There are greening labels and so on. So at the same time, we feel that this contribution would need to be more visible and more recognized, both in the higher education sector itself, but also at policy levels. And therefore, we thought it would be useful to go beyond the individual anecdotal example that everybody knows. I have been at a university which does this and that, and gather some better evidence, some data on what universities actually do to inform policymaking, but also, of course, to be considered in EUA's membership work. And that brings us actually to the survey, and which we conducted right now, actually, in the period from April to May. So Henriette said it's quite fresh, and we can only present you some selective data here today. And what you see here on the map is all the countries from which we received responses and how many responses we received. And in total, we had 390 responses. 305 were from the European higher education area, and then 85 from the eastern and southern neighborhood area, so from countries which are not in the EHEA, but we thought it was important to include them. So in total, we had 305. We are showing data from 305 responses here. Right into the findings. So one important question that we asked in the survey was, do you have a strategy? And here's the answer. So 61 have a strategy in place, another 27 have it under preparation. So it's almost all. But what is interesting here is when you ask institutions how they frame their strategies, from what they are guided, and there you can see the majority of them really refers to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. You will remember them. They have been launched in 2015, and you can see they had already quite a strong impact on the higher education sector, much stronger in some regards than national policies or initiatives, and also European policies and initiatives. So I should say, if you look at the last point here, the EU Green Deal, that's kind of interesting because that has only been launched in 2020, and already 16% of institutions reference it in their strategies. We also asked institutions why they actually engage in environmental sustainability, and what are the motives and what are the drivers. And what you can see here is are the top 5, basically, out of a long list of answer options that we gave them. All of them were voted and rated and found kind of important, but these were the top 5 ones. And as you can see, it's mainly about the institutional values, it's about the mission, and it's about the engagement of leadership, students, and staff. Of lesser importance seem to have been here, of slightly lesser importance, I should say, for example, industry collaboration, and also national policies and guidelines. Let's have a quick look at some of the activities. Obviously, institutions are engaged in a wide range of activities in environmental sustainability. I just picked up here a few examples. One is on education, where you can see the vast majority of institutions considers it in its curriculum reforms and in almost all study programs. Interesting here again, what we saw already on an earlier slide, the Sustainable Development Goals are much more frequently mentioned here than just greening. And to look at some other issues, campus management, research, and partnerships, where you can see that the vast majority of institutions does not only have activities in recycling and waste management, but has also a comprehensive policy for that. Whereas if you look at, for example, reducing the environmental footprint of laboratory research, the number of institutions which have comprehensive policies is significantly lower, but there are many institutions which have some activities, and the same goes a bit for partnerships with other higher education institutions. There it's more balanced. Close 46% have a comprehensive policy, and 42% have just some activities, but quite a strong engagement on these issues. I'm approaching now the topic that we have here today, and this slide is all on the different types of mobility, and we distinguished here between, in our question, between standards and compulsory, or if something was just encouraged or incentivized. And as you can see, certain things are now standards at least 1/3 of the institutions, such as digital tools for teleworking and teleconferences and virtual mobility, but also teleworking and condensed working and teleconferencing and hybrid conferencing. So these have become kind of standards for at least 1/3 of the institutions. And we also learned from the survey that they intend to continue them beyond the survey. What is less common then is virtual mobility as a replacement for physical mobility of staff and students. And even less than practices for commuting on low carbon forms of transportation. So you can really see here kind of the, that first of all, that the COVID crisis obviously had an impact on how institutions took this up. If we would have asked these questions 2 years ago, the answers would have been much, much lower. But then the second point is also, and I think that has to be highlighted, that this is not just about technical issues and reorganization, but it takes also some time to get these things accepted socially and implemented then at the institution. That's it from me for the moment, and I hand back to Henriette.
Thank you very much, Michael, for setting the scene for today's discussions. I see that in the chat there was already a question directed at you, and I took the opportunity to answer it in writing. And indeed, a difficult discussion that we had in the preparation of the survey: how do we define greening activities? I copied in our standard response, or how we put it in the survey, but this was really just a first step. And unless you would like to comment on this one, Michael, I would then.
I couldn't comment anymore. That's the answer.
Okay.
We probably have to develop a shared understanding for that in the sector.
Exactly, indeed. So what you see here in written response was really just our starting point, but indeed our plan is by looking through the results from the survey, but also the various strategies and written responses from our 305 participants, we are planning to further define this area. So I thank you very much for the first person to kick off the question and answer section. You may also note that you can vote for people's questions, so it makes our job a bit easier picking questions later on. But before we go into the discussion round, I would now like to give the floor to the speakers from the higher education institutions, who we have asked to reflect a bit on the findings that Michael has just presented, but of course also to share with us what is happening at their respective universities. And I would like to start with Chris from the University of Edinburgh. So if we could please have his slides. Excellent. The floor is yours, Chris.
Thank you, Henriette. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Krzysztof Twiniuk. I'm Social Sustainability Innovation Engagement Manager at University of Edinburgh. My job entails, my team job entails embedding sustainability and greening action across the University of Edinburgh, both in policies and behaviors and infrastructure and so on. So first of all, university is a member of UNICA, institutional network of universities from across capital cities of Europe. UNICA has a number of working groups, including the Green and SDGs working group, which brings together colleagues who want sustainability strategies and projects and institutions, including how universities address the climate crisis and sustainable development goals. And we're also a founding member or a founder of the Roundtable for Sustainable Academic Travel, which I would invite you to join as well if you're interested in the topic. This is a network that's open to all higher education institutions as a way of sharing knowledge, ideas, and data. And we're hoping that by increasing communications across the network, we will help address business travel emissions across the sector. We've got 85 institutions from 20 different countries so far, and we're very much trying to share whatever works and approaches and academic studies and things like that that help move the topic forward. Reflecting on some of the Michael slides, we have a climate strategy here at the University of Edinburgh. The university has an overarching strategy 2030, which outlines what the university will do in the next decade. It's based on 4 pillars, including on social and civic responsibility, with very strong SDGs throughout it, and a strong focus on becoming net zero carbon by 2040. We're hoping to achieve that not only through our electricity and gas and so on, but also looking at the scope 3, so-called scope 3, so looking at staff and student commuting a bit, business travel, strong focus, and other things like waste, like our supply chains as well, and going there as well. So that's going to be quite a lot of work for us. But in terms of mobility, we've had to do quite a bit of work on business travel. Here attached is the picture from our business travel report, which you can access following the link on the slide. And it shows you that business travel has been growing around 15% a year over the last few years for us. So very much an unsustainable growth. It meant that university was emitting 18,500 tons CO2 just from business travel, and that was growing so fast that we thought that this might be actually one of the main sources of emissions in a few years' time for University of Edinburgh. So we started looking into it, and we started measuring it in other ways. For example, in 1819, the spend was over £11 million alone on business travel without even hotels and things like that. So we've kind of created a coalition of the willing at the university with colleagues from finance, health and safety, procurement, and other departments that had a stake in this. And we started working with senior management to create a working group that presented top leadership with a variety of recommendations, which led to a sustainable travel policy for us. Very much a strong focus on staff well-being, environment, and financial costs. So these are the 3 things that our staff and students who are traveling on behalf of University of Edinburgh should keep in mind. So, for example, if we generally think that it's better if somebody travels less. It's better for the well-being, it's better for the environment, and it costs less. So we're promoting alternatives to travel, very much what Michelle said there. We have things like very strong embedding of virtual conferencing and whatnot, and digital collaborations tools, but also a process by which everybody needs to think about the objectives they want to accomplish from travel, and then think about they actually need to travel to accomplish those objectives. And by standardizing the booking process and those processes across the organization, we're hoping that nobody will go rogue. But still, we still have some way of to go with embedding these things. And we're also, we're also saying that there should be no more air travel within the UK. Edinburgh is quite up north, so we're encouraging staff members to travel to Europe by train, but that's actually quite a long trip. But within the UK, there shouldn't be any air travel anymore, with limited exceptions. We are restricting what we're doing about business travel or about flying. Just use economy class, for example, and supporting really those better decisions for environment, for well-being, such as taking train and sleeper trains if possible. And we're committed to sequestering any remaining carbon, details of which are yet to be announced. And looking beyond business travel on how the mobility interacts with carbon emissions, there is a strong impact on a number of university strategies. For example, university has a strong focus on improving student experience. This is something that we don't do very well currently, according to student surveys. And we are offering every student an international experience as part of their degree at the University of Edinburgh. Now, to give you an example of how we can address sustainability in that, is to offer those international students from outside of UK who come to Scotland, to offer them perhaps internship or some sort of some sort of embedding with a Scottish organization, which would expose them to that really Scottish experience as a way of providing, we think, genuine international experience for them. In terms of partnerships, university is strongly proceeding with increasing global presence, entering new partnerships with other institutions. That obviously has a very big impact on our amount of travel that we were doing in the past, and we probably are likely to be doing it again in the future. So again, how do we do that sustainably? There is a lot of things that we could do smarter, sending less people abroad, thinking about how people are traveling within countries of their destination, and so on. And finally, internationals, we're now considering including international students and visitors. So think people like, students like Erasmus students or staff members from other institutions traveling to us on Erasmus studies, to include those journeys within our carbon reporting and target setting. And then that kind of leads us to further questions of how to split that responsibility. What's a genuine responsibility of University of Edinburgh when international students are traveling to Scotland, and what is a personal responsibility, such as students traveling home for Christmas? So there's still some questions that we need to answer, but that's kind of the gist of our approach on business travel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris, for this overview of the approach of University of Edinburgh. I see that our participants have been fairly active during your presentations, and there are a couple of questions that relate to your presentation, so I'll try to pick at least one up here. You mentioned in your slide on the a sustainable approach to travel, that financial costs are one of the aspects that you are considering in this strategic approach. Now, we have someone here saying that they themselves, I presume their university, saved over 4 million on travel and conference costs in the last year. How do we keep these costs down after the pandemic? But perhaps I can expand this question a little bit, and thinking of train travel in the UK, or perhaps even from the UK to Europe, which of course would be quite costly. How do you balance it in your strategy, you know, on the one hand side being greener, on the other hand also considering costs?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's actually not just about saving costs, it's about balancing costs against well-being and environment. So first of all, don't travel if possible. We use web conferencing and just avoid the travel in the first place. That's the way to save money. But sometimes, as you're saying, train travel will be more expensive than taking the plane. But we recognize that by taking the train, you will be able to work on the train. You will be able to do so many other things. It will be more comfortable for you as well. So even if you spend more, end up spending a bit more, university is fine with that. And that's the message you want to send to staff members, that it's okay to do some other things if it means that environmental and well-being balance, things will balance. The balance of benefits here.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your comment on this as well. I see that one of the highest voted questions is on virtual mobility, and I would like to ask the participants to wait a little bit on this because I don't want to take away from other presentations, and we also have a dedicated discussion round on this particular aspect. But for now, I would like to first send over to Arnim from the University of Bayreuth to tell us a bit more what is happening at his institution and, of course, also in the S group of universities. Arnim, the floor is yours. No, I think we cannot hear you. Or is that just my end? I'm sorry.
No, we can't hear Armin.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I start again. Hello, everyone. A warm welcome from me. I will speak a little bit about sustainability activities of the University of Bayreuth in Germany, as well as the S Group, Universities in Europe, a sustainable university network for over 3 decades with 43 members, 38 from Europe and 5 global members. I think reflecting on Michael's points here, when it comes to sustainability, I think general considerations on sustainability will show that mobility is only one part of a complex and holistic approach. So higher education institutions have to consider energy consumption, as Chris has already said, regional and local transport strategies, building and food management, and comprehensive educational aspects. So since physical mobility is accessible only to 2 to 3% of global learners anyway, it is important to make internationalization barrier-free, less elitist, and thus more environmentally friendly and inclusive. So we think it is key to include innovative practices in internationalization at home, which of course include campus and curriculum internationalization. And here we collaborate with all our S Group members through projects such as SUCTI, which received the EHEA Innovation Award in 2019. And as UBT, we collaborate with our global and local partners and include these considerations in domestic mobility, hybrid mobility considerations, and digitalization. So you can see here that I've mentioned a couple of projects. It comes down to very practical things that we promote: walking, biking, skating, improving the infrastructure for that on campus, encourage trains wherever possible, but also develop more concepts in hybrid mobility. So we use COIL, we use virtual classrooms, business case competitions, and virtual exchange, but also, and that is new since COVID-19, more online intercultural preparation and training for study abroad. And that means also for our incoming students, their study abroad, and our outgoing students as well. But of course, we have been part as S Group and as the University of Bayreuth of a couple of very distinct projects. Here is mentioned Erasmus Without Paper and Erasmus Without Paper 2.0, led by the University of Ghent, one of the S Group members. And we participated in this as a pilot partner. At the University of Bayreuth, we have a sustainability strategy adopted in January of this year. It focuses on energy efficiency, nutrition and health, green campus, mobility, and networking. So it includes concrete objectives in governance and infrastructure, research and teaching. And we encourage and fund research on innovation and sustainability. We enable students to think in a critical and reflexive way on sustainability in their lives. And we are about to become a social pioneer and foster connections in society and the region. We are labeled a green campus, and we do a couple of things that are very important for us. For instance, we invested since 2016 already to become a fair trade university, but also very practical things like self-help workshops for bike repair on campus. So students are encouraged to use their bike instead of coming in by car. But then we have a project initiated 1.5 years ago, and that's the transparent university restaurant and student canteen. So we have a clear description of nutritions, and we encourage to avoid waste and sustainable purchase. And of course, we have an additional study program in sustainability with ECTS attached to it. You see it here on the right side of the slide with an introductory module, an area of specialization, and a project module. The S group has a lot of activities with regard to sustainability. We have the Think Tank Academy as our central knowledge transfer platform, which holds monthly webinars on several issues. Last week, we had a workshop on the social mission of university and also sustainability. One example is our summer school in Shanghai. Of course, everybody has to take a plane to Shanghai, but on site, it's a 4 weeks program. We not only encourage, but we conduct the staff and students travel throughout China. And this goes from Shanghai to Hangzhou to Xi'an and to Beijing by train, which is a challenge to a certain extent, but this aims at avoiding airplane travel. And of course, on site, we try to encourage to all students and staff to do carpooling and car sharing. NTNU from Trondheim, one of our S Group members, as well as the University of Liège in Belgium, have specific scholarships for green travel. So they encourage Erasmus students to travel environmentally friendly as they do, and NTNU also has a strategic partnership to really transfer knowledge addressing climate change through innovative place-based education and blended learning. We have a few more examples. The University of Ghent has a very comprehensive sustainable internationalization strategy for students. Also a green travel concept, very interesting, the aircraft-free communication. So no planes as symbols for global mobility or mobility as such. They decided not to send out physical brochures to partners annually anymore. They have a green guide for new international students, but use, of course, COIL, including intercultural training, and are part of the Roundtable for Sustainable Academic Travel. The University of Las Palmas in Gran Canaria has installed a sustainability office that focuses on energy, mobility, water, and environmental education. And the University of Gothenburg very much is involved in sustainability projects in their European University Alliance, Utopia, with an action, Utopia Climate. But of course, they have actions such as Change the Climate, climate literacy, and an international master's program in marine biological resources. I have listed a few more links, and with this, I would like to give back to Henrietta and hope that I stayed in time.
Absolutely perfect, just on time. Thank you so much for this very comprehensive overview of activities of at your own university, but also of the broader S Group network. Very impressive and very interesting to see how diverse shapes these activities take. Now, I don't think there is a question directly directed at you. However, maybe we can rephrase one a little bit. Now, I noticed that a lot of the initiatives that you mentioned are focusing on the mobility of students, and we have someone in the Q&A who asked whether these kind of activities are coming more top-down, or are they based more on student-led initiatives, because our participant figures these are not always very popular with students. Would you agree, Arnim?
Well, we have student representatives in all our relevant committees and working groups, representatives of student parliament, also of the Erasmus Student Network. And I think we try to reach a balance between grassroots and bottom-up initiatives and opinions and top-down strategic concerns. So I would say it is not merely top-down strategic, not at all.
Great, thank you so much for responding to this question. Now, as I had promised throughout the webinar, we will frame the discussions in presentations with some data from our survey. So before handing over to Marlene, I would actually like to give the floor to Michael again for just 1 minute to give us a little bit more information based on the data of our survey. Michael, the floor is yours.
Yes, thanks, Henriette. And yeah, we also asked institutions about what are barriers and what would be enablers for our environmental sustainability. And here I will not read that out to you. It's quite a bit of data, but probably if we look at the barriers and the enablers, they are obviously mirrored. And so what you can see is it is about coordination, staff and student engagement, but the barriers and enablers are mainly about funding as well. National funding, but also the hope, of course, to get funding from the European Commission. Beyond what is really appreciated and found useful is peer learning and probably also a dedicated initiative at European level. We also tested institutions and asked them if they would like to have any European or national guidelines, but there was only a small minority which wanted them. So it's really about coordination, collaboration, engagement within the institution. It's about funding at national or European level, but then also about peer learning and joint initiatives.
Oh, indeed. Thank you very much, Michael. And you saw it on the slide in the very right-hand corner. About a third of the participants of the survey did ask for a European initiative. And I wanted to use this as the key to hand over to our speaker from the European Commission, Marlene Barthes. And once your slide is up, Marlene, the floor is yours. Voila.
Great, thanks. I hope you can hear me well. Thanks for having me this afternoon. Good afternoon to everyone. I'll try very briefly to present a little bit the policy context at EU level regarding environmental sustainability, as well as the two funding programs that we have with regard to higher education mobility more specifically. So that's Erasmus+, and then the Marie Skłodowska-Curie actions. Now, if we look at the policy context, I think the main policy tool we have is the communication on the European Green Deal, which was published in December 2019, which has very ambitious objectives, as most of you probably know, which is that Europe should become climate neutral by 2050. Now, there are a lot of initiatives happening already, like a new biodiversity strategy. We have a new climate adaptation strategy. There is a climate pact, the Zero Pollution Action Plan, etc. But the Green Deal communication also specifically highlights the key role of education and research in supporting its ambitious objectives, and notably universities and the higher education community. And if we look at that community more specifically, we have two more communications, so policy documents that were published in 2020, which are a communication on the European education area and one on the European research area. And here again, both of these communications specifically mention the new green priorities and how they would support the Green Deal in achieving its goal. The links are in the presentations. I would encourage you really, if you haven't read these communications yet, to do so to get a clearer idea. Now, thanks to these communications, especially the one on the European education area, there have been, or there are currently, a few initiatives that are being developed at EU level. I highlight two of them here. So the first one is a council recommendation on education for environmental sustainability. This is really a policy document, which is supposed to have a more systemic impact at European level in EU member states. And I think also the main idea is to develop a common understanding of what we mean by education for environmental sustainability. Because if we look at the different EU member states, I mean, the implementation, the definitions, etc., are very, very varying. And so it's important to have a common understanding here. This council recommendation is an outcome of the education area communication and the biodiversity strategy, and it is foreseen for adoption in November, I think, this year. But what is more interesting is that this council recommendation will include a framework of competences to develop and assess knowledge, skills and attitudes on climate change and sustainable development. So basically, it's designed at EU level, but it will be put at the disposition of member states to see if they want to include it in their curricula, etc. The second initiative here is the Education for Climate Coalition, which has been launched in December last year. Here, it is less policy focused and more outreach and mobilization focused. So it's a little bit based, for those who know, on the Digital Skills and Jobs Coalition, which was, I think, launched in 2015. And here the idea is that we should create a pan-European climate movement that involves directly individual students, teachers, schools, universities, the whole education community with pledges, so concrete pledges focused on one of the 5 priorities that you have here, which include green skills, awareness raising, etc. So this is a little bit more bottom up, and mapping is being carried out already because a lot of initiatives already exist. So the idea is to build upon existing initiatives and to also facilitate their scale up. So this is a little bit the policy context. If we look at now EU funding programs for higher education specifically and also mobility, these are the 2 main tools that we have at EU level. So I guess you're all familiar with the Erasmus Plus program, which for the new 7 years funding period will have 26.2 billion euros, which is nearly double what we had under the previous program. And I think 70% of that budget will be dedicated to mobility opportunities across all levels of education. So it's not only higher education, we also have school mobility, youth mobility, adult education, etc. And then we have the Marie Skłodowska-Curie actions, which are funded under Horizon Europe, so the research framework program. And here we have 6.6 billion euros over the 7 years, which will support the training and mobility of researchers. So we're talking PhD candidates to postdoc researchers, but also the setup of doctoral programs and postdoctoral programs. So it's not only about mobility, it goes beyond that. And so because these programs are supporting, amongst others, the mobility of individuals, we are, of course, now reflecting on how we can implement greener practices or how we can green these funding programs. Here, it's just a brief overview of what is being done to green the Erasmus Plus program. So, for instance, we have introduced a horizontal priority, a green horizontal priority, together with also inclusion and digital, across the whole program. So to really encourage projects to be more eco-friendly in the design of the activities, to think about using green travel or promoting green travel, and also developing green skills. So that's a horizontal priority. As you probably very well know, there's also the European Student Card Initiative, the Erasmus Plus app. So we're also trying to go more digital and to replace all the heavy paper processes. There will be increased financial support to support green travel. So, for instance, the standard travel support, which exists in nearly all actions of Erasmus Plus, will be increased by 15% in case of green travel. So that's for higher education, but also youth, vet, adult education, schools, etc. For higher education, more specifically, there will be a €50 top-up of the individual support for students who do not receive any travel support. So in case these students decide to use a green mode of transport, they would get additional €50. And then, of course, we've mentioned it in the previous speeches, it entails additional traveling time. So most actions foresee also additional days for travel, for green travel. Another initiative would be to monitor the carbon footprint of the mobility. So participants will be asked to indicate which means of transport they are using. We also have our online platforms such as eTwinning or EPALE for adult learning. So there's a lot of support material, exchange of best practices, etc. Michael just mentioned that actually peer learning and exchange of best practice is one of the ways, or one of the supports sought after by universities. So material exists. And then, of course, what we can do easily is also to reach out to the wider community and raise awareness on green issues, environmental sustainability, because through Erasmus Plus, we have huge networks of alumni, schools, universities, you name it. So that's a little bit for the Erasmus greening. And then to finalize, a little bit looking at the Marie Skłodowska-Curie actions, so under Horizon Europe. We have developed a so-called Msca Green Charter, actually with the help of EOA and a number of experts. So we have set up this charter, which basically is a list of principles. It's a short document, which will encourage Msca beneficiaries, so institutions and individuals, to minimize the environmental impact of research activities. So it's very concrete suggestions, such as, ensuring more sustainable project events, using conferencing tools on top of, to complement physical mobility, to use less or more renewable energy sources, these kind of things. So this is not mandatory, meaning that at application stage, people will be encouraged to follow this Green Charter. And at final report stage, all the projects will have to report on what they have done to actually implement or minimize the environmental impact of their activity. So with this soft approach, we hope that we will steer people towards the right direction and also raise awareness on the Green Deal. Now, together with this Green Charter, we will do a compilation of guidance material, so that it doesn't come out of nowhere, so that people actually have concrete examples of what we mean by this. Another just quick point, we will be organizing in July this year, on 6 and 7 July, what we call a cluster event, and will be a Green Deal cluster event, bringing together successful projects funded under the MSCA, but also Erasmus Plus, the EIT, so the European Innovation, I lost it now. So the EIT and European universities initiatives, but also even Creative Europe projects focusing on research and innovation, Green Deal related. So I think this will be very useful to exchange best practice and create networking opportunities. And it will also bring together policymakers with these projects to influence also our policymaking at EU level. And then finally, we will also have in 2021 the European Researchers' Night, which is a very big event, which will have a thematic focus on the Green Deal. And then the Researchers at School initiative, where actually we invite researchers to come back to schools and present their research results in various areas, including environmental sustainability. So in a nutshell, this is what is happening at EU level, to give you an idea.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Marlene, for summing up both the policy side, the side of MSCA, as well as the Erasmus Plus program. Thank you so much. And of course, we will share your slides and all the links after with participants who have already been asking some very specific questions. A couple of them were on virtual mobility, which we will move on to in a moment. But we have a more general question around who these activities are open to, specifically the Education for Climate Coalition, but also the other areas, I suppose. Is this something that is open to institutions or sector representatives from the EU, the EHEA, or all non-associated countries, perhaps even?
Okay, that's a geographic question.
Sorry, perhaps too technical then.
No, it's a bit tricky because I simply don't know the answer. I know that for now, I mean, the Council recommendation is more European level, so all the mapping and pledges, etc. But I wouldn't preclude or exclude that actually it would also be open more internationally. But this I would have to double check with the colleagues in charge. But for who can, for example, for the Education for Climate Coalition, so who can submit a pledge? Really anyone. So it could be institutions, it could be individual students, it could be parent associations. So yes, anyone is really invited to submit a pledge.
Excellent. Thanks so much. And then I think this precludes our presentation rounds, and I would like to move on to the discussion round and ask all the other speakers to turn on their cameras again. I had already hinted at a couple of times. We were indeed planning to start on the aspect of virtual mobility. One of the data that Michael didn't share with you was that we did have a question on the situation with regards to COVID-19 in our survey. How can you not in these days? And in this question, we found that also post-COVID-19, more than half of the 300 institutions that we have there are considering in the long term to further explore virtual mobility for staff and students. We see that there's high interest also here amongst the participants who, for instance, ask, how do you define a virtual mobility for a student and how can this be really useful for a student? So perhaps I would like to first give the floor to our representatives from the higher education institutions to tell us a bit more about their experience with virtual mobility. Perhaps you're already in a position to answer the question of our participant here, or tell us a bit of pros and cons. And maybe we can start with Arnim, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Great.
So first of all, I think there were a couple of formats in place for about 10 years already. And I've mentioned one of them, that's the virtual classroom. So it included virtual mobility and combined with physical mobility. So hybrid formats are something that we have very good experience with already pre-COVID. During COVID, we had a lot of students who were interested in virtual mobility, and even at the beginning of COVID still in physical and virtual mobility. So they traveled abroad and participated in the educational activities online, but were still in the country. And the same happened with students who came to us. So I think a balancing of physical and digital approaches is a very good example for that. On the other hand, we have target groups that may not lean towards a study abroad or even a business mobility abroad for several reasons, for family reasons or others. And for them, virtual mobility is an extreme good chance to get this international and intercultural experience. And we also have already good experiences with that. And I can also confirm that we will further explore that. Back to you, Henriette.
Thank you very much, Arnim. Chris, would this reflect the situation at University of Edinburgh?
Yes, very much so. Yeah, very much looking at similar things that Arnim has already said, and benefits for accessibility for those kind of web-based solutions.
Great. Michael, would you like to comment?
Well, just I think Armin put it right. You know, it's about enhancing choices, and rather than physical versus virtual mobility, it's about how you combine them in an intelligent way, and that might change then the virtual or the physical experience. I found it interesting that Armin said that this is already 10 years that we are using virtual classrooms, because what we see from our research, they are used. You have at every institution probably somebody who does it, but they haven't really been mainstream. I mean, we just conducted before the COVID crisis a study on digital learning and teaching, where we saw that 25% of institutions had virtual mobility in place. So, but I think in this 1 year now, things have really changed. So it's much more common now than it was before.
Yes, I'd like to hand over to Marlene. You're raising your hand.
Yes, so was maybe just to complement from the EU side, and a little bit, I don't know, the future outlooks for Erasmus Plus as well as the Msca regarding virtual mobility. I mean, physical mobility will remain one of the key priorities of this program, and we're not really intending on changing this. However, as you've probably seen, and if you look at the Erasmus Plus program guide, for instance, blended mobility will now be a thing. So really combining physical and virtual mobility. So this is a new opportunity offered by the program, which is also, in order to be a little bit more inclusive, as Michael and Arnim actually just said, that these more flexible formats would allow bigger participation of other target groups. Otherwise, we do have the Erasmus Plus virtual exchanges, which existed in the past, which target the South Med region. So there are already some fully virtual, let's say, mobility opportunities. So this is also one of the initiatives. And then let's not forget that digital. So I mentioned green as a horizontal priority in the program, but actually digital is another horizontal priority. So I assume that in the future we will see many, many more projects, including more and more digital aspects in the design of their activities. And we also have launched a digital education action plan, 2021-2027. So there's a number of activities also in there at EU level. That's it.
Thank you very much, Marlene, for elaborating a bit more on what is in the Erasmus Plus and Msca programs with regards to virtual mobility. So perhaps not, as one of our participants asked, not really the end of physical mobility for students.
No.
Oh, good. Yes. I don't know if any of you is in a position to comment on whether have you received feedback from students who have participated in these kind of activities, or maybe there's someone with a student background actually in the QA and can comment. Would anyone be able to say something? No? Okay, Arnim, please.
Very briefly, we had positive feedback of those students who went abroad and then participated in online education, because they said it helps when you fold your laptop and Korea isn't gone, right? So you're still in the country. So this combination of virtual mobility and physical mobility was very good. On the other hand, all the preparatory offers that we now have for students before they go abroad, they are very, very much appreciated, and especially also these orientation and welcoming programs, especially for students who might come later because they have visa issues, etc. So in former times they missed all that. Now they can participate in the online activities and then arrive and still have the information, and that is appreciated as well. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. I think I would like to now move on to another question in the Q&A. It's about linking institution-specific greening activities, such as focus on zero emissions, to a broader approach and strategy on education for sustainable development. I think our institutional speakers have already hinted at those, but perhaps we can elaborate a bit more here. The question is targeting particularly the whole institution approach involving all stakeholders, such as the students, as we were just talking about them, and the mission of the universities to educate more broadly. So as a representative from a higher education institution and or stakeholder organization, how to link all the pieces of the universities together, so to say, in this kind of activity. Chris?
So we do quite a large variety of things along those lines, embedding SDGs and making sure every student has, so similar to what Arnim already said, every student has an opportunity to do those sustainability courses, whether engineering or medicine or environmental course. But also we're starting doing things like launching training events for staff and students, and blended staff and student networks. So places where staff and students get to interact with each other, get the same training, get the same skills, and are asked to work on the same projects on carbon literacy or other sustainability education. And we're hoping that will slightly blend the lines and encourage ones to work with the others and create, for example, opportunities for students to write their dissertations in those areas with colleagues or staff members or things like that.
Thank you. Arnim?
I just want to mention one aspect. I think it is key that any institutional strategy has to be a participative process in involving all stakeholders of the university, but also go beyond campus to local stakeholders, and in some cases, if you talk about joint programs, for instance, double degree, dual degree programs, joint PhD programs, then also go beyond to international partners and involve them in the discussion and in the strategy building. And that, in our experience, or according to our experience, increases the buy-in and commitment of the different groups. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Michael, Marlene, would you like to come in?
Not much to add from my side. It's just like what Armin and Chris had said. I mean, it's confirmed in the survey what we see there, the point of engagement, participatory approaches, and that's obviously important. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe just from my side, I mean, how we wish to influence a little bit institutions is through this green charter that I have mentioned, which, okay, it's for the MSCA, but it's actually, it could be any institution, regardless of whether they participate in an MSCA project or not, because we hope that, you know, by pushing for them to consider these principles in the Green Charter, that, you know, it will also help them develop more institutional strategies. It will also reinforce the individual researchers towards the hierarchy and maybe be able to push a little bit to a more comprehensive approach at institutional level. So yeah, we hope that this will be a first step for some institutions that do not have these comprehensive strategies in place yet.
Arnim?
I would like to answer with my second hat now, as the president of S Group. So we think that the peer learning effect between institutions is really tremendous, because also senior leadership can be convinced if other institutions have really promising practices developed. And that is what we, and what UNICA does as well. Also, we collaborate very closely as networks, really in our think tank academy, to exchange best and promising practices and know what the others do, and really with an open book philosophy encourage each other to try things, and that is very important. Thanks.
Yeah, if I might react to that, actually, yes, I think we agree completely that the exchange of best practice or guidance is a good first step for many institutions, or to engage more people. And that's why we will, together with the Green Charter, publish. So we will have a dedicated web page, if you want, for greening the implementation of research activities. And on there, we have, with the help of EUA and other experts, gathered a number of good initiatives that we will list as guidance material, and we will also share some success stories, etc., to just bring inspiration, I think, to projects or future applicants, and encourage them to follow along the same path. So I agree that exchange of best practice is a good way forward. So if you have anything to share, feel free. We can still include it in the guidance material to be published.
Excellent. Yes, thank you so much. And indeed, that was also one of the basic ideas behind the survey. And I answered this already in writing in the Q&A section. But besides the survey data, we will also publish, we're not sure yet of the format, but in a way, an overview of networks, of practices, of university strategies, even in the autumn of this year, for everyone's consideration. I see that we are actually already running over time, but thank you very much for actively participating in the discussion. If the speakers don't mind, then I would actually like to table one more question, unless you all shake your head now. No, it's good. Okay, because I noticed that a lot of our discussion today was focusing towards the mobility side of the headline of this webinar. But of course, we also entitled it The Future of Internationalization. So maybe we can just raise one more point or question around this area as well. And I hope the participants and speakers will bear with me here. This would be a question around, let's call it green diplomacy through higher education internationalization. So as a bit of a background, Marlene already mentioned a number of policy initiatives that are also looking globally. The EU has, for instance, announced to show global leadership by leading by example, to engage in green alliances, to come up with tailored geographical strategies. We know that a quarter of the development assistance will be tagged to fighting climate change, as will other funds who also have these kind of tags. And we also heard from Marlene already, the communication on the European education area explicitly mentions the green transition as a goal for higher education collaboration. Specifically there, the target is for Africa and the southern and eastern neighborhood regions. So maybe we can just take a moment and discuss the potential role of higher education institutions in these policy ambitions. And I would like to first give the floor again to the representatives from the universities or university networks and ask whether this is a topic that you already actively engage in as a university or as an organization with your membership, and how you would see the role of higher education in green diplomacy, so to say. Who would like to start? Michael, perhaps?
Yes, I think that's a really good point, and we have seen that also in the recent approach towards international research and innovation collaboration. So I think that's a good point, and it's a good topic for institutions to work with each other. I mean, the only concern is probably when you talk about European standards, that this might look slightly patronizing, but I think we know how to work in universities on that. And what Armin just said about peer learning between institutions, and there's no reason to restrict that to Europe. That goes, of course, also internationally. And I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation also that we gathered some data on the eastern and southern neighborhood. So that was, of course, with the purpose to start it with very concretely with colleagues in that region.
Excellent, thank you. And Michael is gone. Okay, there.
Okay, again, sorry.
Would anyone else like to comment? Sure. I think Marlene was first.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very complicated and interesting question, quite large. So I think you could have a dedicated webinar just on this. But yes, as you said, well, I mean, the green and digital, so the twin transitions, as we call them, are reflected in all, I think, our policy instruments now, including the external cooperation ones. So with countries outside the EU, we do have a number of policy dialogues with either regions or individual countries targeting higher education specifically, where this topic of green transition will be brought up, or is already being brought up. As you said, the European education area has or makes clear references to this. There will be a follow-up strategy for universities to the European education area communication, where there will also be specific areas focusing on international cooperation as well as the greening or the green transition. So I think here again, we will keep it in mind. In general, I mentioned that green is a horizontal priority under Erasmus+. And we already have this horizontal priority in cooperation projects, so Key Action 2 projects. You know that this year we didn't have international funds available yet. So for cooperation was outside or non-EU countries, so the external cooperation instrument. But we foresee in the future, so for instance, for capacity building in higher education, the action under Erasmus+, that there will be also a priority focusing on the green transition. So to assist higher education systems and institutions to develop knowledge in that regard. So that will most likely happen under Erasmus+. So there will be funds available and a new priority. And then, I mean, for the Msca, I said we have this green charter, so it's also a horizontal approach. It's a very international program. So institutions from non-EU countries largely participate both in Erasmus Plus actually and the MSCA. So whatever green priorities we have in there also will have an impact, of course, in institutions worldwide. Yes, and then more broadly also the Horizon Europe program. For instance, we had a Green Deal call, which was also open internationally. We have the Horizon Europe missions, big missions coming up, which will also be open internationally. So I think there's a lot of room for cooperation with partners, not only in the South Med and Eastern Partnership, but really worldwide.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Marlene. I saw that also Chris and Arnim had their hands up, so I'd like to give the floor to Chris first.
Thank you, Henriette. I think there is actually crucial need for us to cooperate internationally with other institutions globally on this very topic. So, for example, in the theme of mobility, if we, as a sustainability department, try to pursue the greening and reducing business travel for our academics, that could put them at a competitive disadvantage with comparing to other institutions globally. Therefore, we need to move as a sector forward and as a sector change our policies. And for that, we need to talk to colleagues and exchange experiences and exchange best practices so that we can all kind of change how we conduct our business in a way that will not be detrimental to our own colleagues. And that way we'll also secure more buy-in within our institution. So again, I'd be happy to share a link to the business travel academic, so the roundtable for academic business travel, which I invite everybody to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. And Arnim?
I would like to first mention that the S Group, for instance, last year in its think tank academy had as an umbrella topic a holistic and responsible framework for sustainable internationalization. And it is interesting to discuss systemic decision-making routines and criteria for future sustainability and responsible internationalization. And that helps to form own strategies. And the Think Tank Academy has regional think tanks. We have a think tank for Africa and a think tank for Latin America, also a think tank for China. And there we also discuss these issues with colleagues from the regions, but also with among ourselves. And when it comes to the University of Bayreuth, then of course we have certain research developments, such as the campus additive innovation and also within our cluster of excellence, Africa Multiple, with the 4 African cluster centers that we have across Africa, that we tackle these issues and develop concepts from public health to global health, now to planetary health, to consider all the necessary engagement that research has to do and to translate it into societal awareness on one hand. On the other hand, it is good to have specific education programs, such as our Bavarian elite program, Global Change Ecology, that has been there for 10 years, and it really focuses on transmitting and disseminating the findings on global change, but also other programs like environmental chemistry and environmental geography that are really keen on in the educational area to raise this awareness. And of course, we have recently opened a new strand where we particularly focus on food, nutrition, and health sciences. These aspects of international cooperation. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for these comments. Unless anyone else would like to share something, I think we're well over time now, actually. 15 minutes. I hope the discussion was enlightening and interesting to all our participants. Just trying to sum it up, I would say that it's not only about research collaboration and research into environmental sustainability and greening, but also peer learning, leading by example, sharing your practice with your partners around the world, and that additional funding and policy support is coming up, hopefully. And so all that remains for me to do now is to share with you then the upcoming EoA activities, I mentioned at the very beginning of this webinar that this is part of a series. And on Thursday and Friday this week, we will talk about two specific aspects. On Thursday, 3rd June, on learning and teaching and how linking SDGs, environmental sustainability, into learning and teaching practices. And on Friday, we will hear a bit more about a topic that we touched upon a little bit today already, namely university strategies, how to implement them, how to monitor change, and so on. I would also like to raise your attention to the fact that EoA is currently running another webinar series in parallel. This is on universities and the future of scholarly publishing. And on 8th of June, our colleagues will discuss transformative agreements with you. You can find these and other events on EoA's events webpage. And I would like to thank very much all the speakers for participating in today's discussion. Also all the participants to sticking around a bit longer and asking very good questions. And I hope to see you very soon in one of these webinars and wish you a very nice afternoon.